By the year 2000, more people will live in cities than outside of them. This will be a first in the history of civilization. Within the megacities of the world lies the potential for social and economic progress on an incredible scale. But there is equal capacity for misery. Cities reflect the best and worst of humanity. They are order and chaos, creativity and repression, beauty and despair. They are the essence of us all. What lures people to cities is a dream of something better.
It was often said that, God gave us nature, mankind gives us cities. And I guess you would say that cities embodied the aspirations of people. They were considered great achievements. The city was the capital. It was a holy place. It was the center of culture, commerce, and it was a place where individuals were improved. They were bettered.
It is an ancient pattern. People drawn by the siren song of commerce, jobs, and education. They arrive carrying their dreams and aspirations and their ethnic and cultural identities.
It's a vortex of so many different things, the energy and the diversity. It's extraordinary.
It's a lot of hustle, a lot of bustle. You gotta use a lot of muscle. So it's really good. Keeps you sharp.
You never know what's gonna happen. That's kind of the fun part of it,
They create art and architecture, music and theater.
I guess there's some truth to that, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere.
There's a great deal of accident, coincidence, and good luck in the whole thing. And the character of cities themselves adds to that. And there are places where people are less friendly or more friendly, or where they take 2-hour lunches or eat in their offices. Cities have characters like people, and you can't really predict how the chemistry is going to work out.
The healthiest cities are in a constant state of flux. The more responsive to change, the more alive the city. Modern structures rise atop the old as the city reinvents itself. A city's past is locked in layers beneath its outer skin. Almost 100 feet below the streets of London, engineers are at work on one of the most massive construction projects in the world. Workers building an extension to London's famed tube system have uncovered a major archaeological find.
This is quite a large fragment of Roman roofing tile. Well, we are actually finding a city under a city. I mean, as time goes by, the cities kind of like get higher and higher and higher, and we're looking at the original city here, which is probably dating to around about AD 50. We've been finding Roman walls belonging to buildings which fronted onto the original Roman road leading northwards from the south coast across the Thames and into Londinium, which was the original capital of the Roman province of Britannia. To the south of the river, a suburb developed around this major routeway from the continent, and we're right in the middle of that sort of suburb to Londinium right now.
Today, Londinium's Roman suburbs are part of central London. This new 10-mile extension is the latest addition to the tube, an urban transport system that carries more than 2.5 million passengers a day. All modern cities need to move lots of people around every day, quickly and efficiently. It's an urban imperative. Until the mid-19th century, people traveled only as fast as their legs or their horses could carry them. With the Industrial Revolution came hordes of workers to toil in urban factories. The influx was so great that traffic came to a virtual standstill. Nobody could get where they were going on time. The solution, London found, lay underground. Attempts were made to build a train line just below street level, but it proved too noisy and disruptive. Engineers were forced to dig deep level tunnels, creating the world's first underground subway system. The age of commuting had begun. The London Underground began operating in 1858 and carried 10 million passengers in its first year alone. A resounding success, Paris and New York were soon building their own versions. Today, many megacities have underground systems. This latest spur to the London Tube will take close to 5 years to complete.
This is heavy civil engineering. This is infrastructure. This is building the railways for people in the future. And someday people will run on it and will forget the works that these guys have done. And the miners and the engineers and the inspectors that looked after the work and worried that to make sure that the thing is safe.
The organs, veins, and arteries which lie beneath the city's skin are delicate and complex. Engineers must proceed with extreme caution to avoid the millions of miles of water and sewer tunnels, telephone and power lines, gas mains, and fiber optic cables that pulse beneath the city and give it its life. The frenetic pace of invention in the 19th century changed cities forever. And no change was more radical than the harnessing of electricity. It quickly became the lifeblood of the city, thanks to Thomas Edison, who invented the light bulb in 1879.
Successful in the turning of the night today. We'd like to thank you, Mr. Thomas Alva Edison, for a dose of your electrical medicine. Hey, Thomas, you're an incandescent, luminescent miracle man.
The sudden demand for electricity led to another elaborate underground system. The city became wired. Street lamps switched from gas to electric and multiplied astronomically all over the city. Electric motors transformed everything from transportation to tools. Factories instituted night shifts. The 24-hour city was born. And so were the city of lights and the city that never sleeps. All this requires wiring on a massive scale. London, for example, uses so much electrical cable that if spliced end to end, it would encircle the globe. In every city, there are dozens of transformer stations which convert high-voltage electricity down to safer levels. In London's West End, a transformer hums along beneath the entertainment district. The theaters use so much electricity that stagehands say when house lights go up, the surrounding area dims. Electrical light has changed the night skies of cities big and small. No longer can you look up and see any but the brightest stars. Looking back to Earth from hundreds of miles up is another story. Thousands of new constellations sparkle from below. Cities gleaming with billions of electric lights. Lighting up a city is a far more recent advancement than keeping us from going thirsty. The ancient Romans were the first to figure out water distribution. They used gravity. By 97 AD, aqueducts built on a gentle downhill grade carried 85 million gallons of water daily from many miles away. Modern New York uses the same low-tech idea. Gravity brings water 125 miles from the Catskill Mountains. Through a system of aqueducts and reservoirs. The water goes underground for the last 20 miles through 2 gigantic and aging tunnels. So great is New York's thirst that the old tunnels must operate constantly at full capacity, 1.5 billion gallons a day. The tunnels, one built in 1885 and the other in 1928, can't be shut down for a checkup. So city engineers are performing a bypass operation. They're building a third tunnel.
Coming at you, Pete. If either City Tunnel number 1 or City Tunnel number 2 were to have a problem, we could not fully deliver the water to the city of New York. This tunnel will provide a backup which will allow us to be able to supply water.
Every city depends on people like these who keep the heart of the urban infrastructure ticking.
I've been in this business 15 years. 15 years I've been in this business. My father started in 1946 on a Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. My uncles worked on a water tunnel number 2 in the 30s. I love it. It's the greatest job in the world.
The third tunnel is due to be completed in 2006. It will use gravity just like the aqueducts of the ancient Romans. In modern cities, gravity is used to make water go up as well as down by using the pressure created by the sheer weight of it all.
The pressure that we can get by gravity from these systems upstate can basically raise the water to the level of a 5-story house. A lot of the houses were built originally to 5 and 6 stories high, so there's no energy cost associated with pumping. When you have apartment houses where you have higher levels, then you have to either pump the water up to a tank on the roof and then let it come down, or else you then build some kind of pressure system in the basement which pumps it up to the levels above.
All most of us notice is that water magically appears when the faucet is turned on. And trash disappears when it's left in a bag on the sidewalk on a certain day. The city's bodily functions, like our own, are rarely discussed. The most basic and basest of these is the process of elimination, the sewer system. In the mid-19th century, improved water systems led to the invention of the flush toilet. Human waste disposal took a giant leap forward. But there was nowhere for it to go except into the public waterways. In London, for instance, the River Thames became choked with waste, and the citizens were left up the proverbial creek without a paddle. Waterborne illnesses like cholera were killing off thousands. But little was done until Parliament literally got wind of it.
In 1858, a significant event occurred which fate came in and lent a hand, as it were. The River Thames was, of course, by this time pretty filthy and pretty stinking, and was so offensive that the MPs in the House of Commons and several committees had to leave because they couldn't stand the stench. Consequently, they demanded that before any business was undertaken, that something be done about the river.
Something was done. A series of underground tunnels, some large enough to house a train, were hand-dug, creating a giant labyrinth of sewer lines. The next problem was what to do with the stuff. The Victorians, ever the ones for delicacy, built elaborate pumping stations where the sewage was neutralized by a potent chemical mix. The splendid new system rid the city of cholera, but it didn't make the river any safer. Once a cesspool, the Thames became a toxic cocktail. In 1897, a Thames River ferry capsized, throwing its passengers into a poisonous brew. Though only a few yards from shore, most of them never reached it.
Although the river was free of the severe bacteria and pathogens in sewage, the chemical contamination was such that although most of the people could swim, they nearly all died in this disaster.
Sewage treatment has come a long way.
Wastewater treatment sites are not normally the most attractive places to visit in the world. The process that we deal with is, how shall we say, not pleasant. But we try to do it in a professional manner. So most people, once they flush the toilet, would tend to forget about it and allow us to just deal with it.
At the plant, waste is now treated organically. The same bacteria that live in the sewage are now being used to digest it. The byproduct of this digestion is methane, which itself is used as a fuel for the powerhouse, creating a remarkably efficient closed system. It works so well, only 15 employees at the plant can handle the waste of 2.7 million people. That's 10,000 flushes per second. The Thames and virtually every other metropolitan river in the developed world have seen raw sewage vanish from their waters in a mere half-century. The first true cities sprang up between 3,000 and 4,000 BC in the fertile crescent of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, probably resulting from a surplus of food. For the first time, not everyone had to toil in the fields. Some people could become something else: craftsman, priest, scribe, merchant. Over the centuries, two distinct kinds of cities emerged. The natural, organic city usually appears where it does for a particular reason: the confluence of trade routes, the court of a king, the shore of a natural harbor. Then it grows like a living thing.
A good example of that would be the medieval city, which is a kind of rabbit warren of little streets and squares, and nothing is straight. It doesn't follow a diagram, and yet there's a kind of logic to it. They're often very beautiful, but somehow accidental. You just put it together as you go along. Cities like LA are organic cities too. They're much bigger scale, but Those freeways simply are built as you need them. They curve, they twist. There's no obvious logic to it. And like a medieval city, if you don't live there, you immediately get lost.
The other kind of city is a planned one. They are generally built by people with ulterior motives. A real estate developer, an industrialist who builds a company town, a despot seeking to expand his empire. Planned cities have orderly designs. They are rational and efficient. Usually they are laid out on a grid. Imperial Rome was the quintessential grid city. Its plan was copied in cookie-cutter fashion as the Romans conquered new territory, building towns as they went.
They wanted to lay them out very quickly. They wanted the soldiers to be familiar with each city. No matter where you were posted, the cities were identical. There was a square in the middle and 2 streets, and so it was like an army camp. No matter where it is, it's always the same.
During the first millennium AD, Imperial Rome had a New World counterpart. The abandoned city of Teotihuacan lies 20 miles north of modern Mexico City. It too is a planned metropolis.
It's the first huge urban development in Mesoamerica. Before this city was constructed, there are no huge urban centers. This was the first and the most planified of all. It was very orthogonal, that is, all the streets and buildings were parallel and perpendicular one to another.
The city was built on the spot that Teotihuacans believed to be the center of the universe, where time began. It was deliberately mapped out according to the movements of the stars in relation to the mountains on the horizon.
Many of the ancient cultures built cities first and foremost for religious reasons, and the plans of the city sometimes represent something about the religious organization.
Like the Romans, Teotihuacan planners understood what made a city work.
The ancient designers of the city were not simply architects and designers. They were also urbanists. With great understanding of spatial distribution, they allotted areas for religious, administrative, economic, and all other activities.
Rural residents migrated to the gleaming new city in great numbers. Many others were forced there as slave labor. At the height of its prosperity, about 500 AD, it is estimated to have held between 125,000 and 200,000 people. Sometime in 700 AD, the first great metropolis in the Western Hemisphere failed completely. Triumph led to tragedy. The swollen population's need for food and water outpaced the ability of the surrounding natural environment to supply it. Ethnic and class differences are thought to have led to violence. A city must respond to the shifting needs of its population, or it will simply flare up and burn out. Teotihuacan is an ancient but by no means outdated example.
Cities are in general very vulnerable settings. I believe we can use Teotihuacan as a micro model of what is happening with Mexico City. Why? Even though their societies very far in time and very different. Erosion, deforestation, overexploitation of water springs, problems of integration of people with different interests, excessive rural-urban migration. These are phenomena that you see in both examples. So I believe that modern Mexicans should use Teotihuacan as an example of what is vulnerable in urban settings, not only to natural hazards, but also to social problems.
Overcrowding always leads to trouble. In the Middle Ages, the small, densely packed cities were cauldrons of pestilence. Diseases like bubonic plague were spread quickly through cramped towns by rat-borne fleas. In the 14th century, plague raced through Western Europe, wiping out half the population. Problems from overcrowding continued to dramatically affect life in cities, especially during the great advancements of the Industrial Revolution. Factories sprouted and workers flocked to the city as never before. Cities burgeoned, first in England, then in the rest of Europe, and finally in America. Immigrants streamed across the Atlantic, arriving by the tens of thousands to seek jobs in the land of opportunity. Never before had immigration occurred on this kind of scale. While the Industrial Revolution may have remade the great cities of Europe, it created the American urban landscape. Within half a century, the United States would become the most urbanized country in the world.
American cities are not shaped by kings or emperors, or largely not even by great city planners. They're really shaped by individuals, by developers, by people doing things on a small scale. And it all kind of comes together, and what comes out of it, which is often a surprise, is an expression in some way of all these forces. So in that sense, they're very much the shapes of democracy.
The next big change in American cities led to a lot of stiff necks. The Industrial Revolution had produced two inventions: stronger, lighter steel beams and the elevator that made the skyscraper possible. Developers took it from there. The first modern skyscraper was New York's Woolworth Building, built in 1913. It was 58 stories high, almost an eighth of a mile up, well over 100 feet higher than any building in the world. Chicago and New York tried to top each other with ever higher skyscrapers. The urban skyline was born. Arriving in New York for the first time in 1935, the visionary French architect Le Corbusier was close to ecstasy.
We saw the mystic city of the New World appear far away, a spectacle of brutality and savagery, a completely new and prodigious architectural event. With one stroke, Europe is thrust aside.
The new American industrial cities gave rise to more than radical architecture. They spawned American popular culture. Jazz, blues, amusement parks, and movie palaces all came of age in American cities. The urban cultural revolution continued through the 1930s, but the building boom was stalled by the Depression, then stopped altogether during World War II. Growth would not begin again until after the war. This time, it would be out instead of up.
After World War II, we had loads of veterans coming back. We had a big economic growth. The country had every imaginable policy to discourage people from living in the cities and encourage people to live in the suburbs. President Eisenhower announced a huge interstate program. Interstate programs would not help cities. These were programs that help people get away from cities and get into the suburbs.
Metropolitan New York became a great sprawling construction site controlled by one man, road-building impresario Robert Moses.
He was a great builder and a great manager, and he was influencing what was going on in the rest of the country and the rest of the world. They're all watching New York.
New York and most American cities were bedecked with great ribbons of concrete and steel. Highways, tunnels, expressways, and bridges all made it easy to get out of town. And that's just what urbanites did, taking their disposable income with them.
We subsidized to the tune of over $50 billion the development of a pretty complex highway system that made it possible for you to live 20 miles away and drive in town.
The city looked on as the American dream moved to the suburbs. The cult of the automobile changed the urban scene forever.
Like so many people these days, we live in the suburbs, and Dave needs the car every day for business. When he was gone, I was practically a prisoner in my own home, but that's all changed now. 3 weeks ago, we bought another Ford.
New York led the way in choosing the automobile over increased investment in mass transit. A choice that drastically changed the American urban scene.
A lot of people fault Robert Moses. I fault the elected officials at the time who said, let's neglect our transit system and let's build roads. And Moses built parts of the Long Island Expressway. He built parts of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, the Belt Parkway. He built the Battery Tunnel, the Queens Midtown Tunnel, the Triborough Bridge, the Verrazano Bridge. And I look at an example like the Verrazano Bridge. It was built in 1963, 1964 open, and it's 12 lanes for cars. Well, where are the pedestrians? Where do the bike riders go? Where do the trains go?
A city dependent on automobile commuters is a city in the middle of a bad dream. Urban traffic problems are at disaster levels in megacities around the world. Just ask any commuter. Until the late 1960s, traffic lights were manually programmed to read only 2 or 3 settings. Today, though you might not think it, computers allow for greater coordination.
The system that you see behind me is comprised of a coaxial cable system. We put out approximately 260 miles. That's 260 miles of cable in Manhattan. With this cable system, we are now able to talk to approximately 2,700 intersections.
To keep traffic moving, relatively speaking, lights are programmed from a central location to meet shifting conditions. The key is to keep them changing in a rhythmic sequence on the uptown-downtown avenues.
It's a delicate balance because there's traffic in both directions as well as pedestrian traffic in both directions. So we try and make sure that everybody's accommodated. Here we're looking at a particular intersection, and it describes that the main street is getting the green, while the pedestrians have the walk phase across the side street in front of Gracie Mansion. If we wait a few seconds, these should be turning into a flashing don't walk mode. And these should be going into amber, this all red phase, and now green with the associated walk ability across the main street.
The computer is not the only sensor on the job at traffic control.
We have 28 monitors up there. With this new system, we have the capability of monitoring traffic at every intersection in the borough of Manhattan.
Coordinators can see fender benders as they happen and immediately reprogram lights to ease traffic snarls. All this technology may ultimately make traffic flow better in downtown areas, but it does nothing to stem the flow of wealth out of the city to the suburbs and beyond. The older industrial cities are especially hard hit.
These cities that evolved over time based on an economy that was changing, we lost those jobs, lost those industries. As the people moved out, the retail moved out, the jobs moved out, the tax base declined, services declined, so the cities are stuck in the situation that if they increase the taxes to improve the services, they drive out more of the businesses and the jobs.
The rent is high, people can't afford it. Look at this guy. He's been here over 20 years, and yesterday he left. And the store over here, $50 50 years, she left. Across the street, about 4 stores empty. People leaving. There's no money in Orchard Street anymore like it used to.
What's left in many of these inner cities is an enormous underclass.
We encouraged the development of suburban America. The policies were focused on individuals, not on building economies, but dealing with immediate needs, whether it was income assistance or food stamps. As the community organizers say, they give you fish, they don't teach you to fish. And the net result of this is we've changed fundamentally the urban economy. If you went to Los Angeles in the early 1960s, maybe 1 job out of 3 was a manufacturing job that paid the wage that could support a family. If you go there today, it might be 1 job out of 10, and it's continuing in that direction.
Joblessness leads to hopelessness. Hopelessness leads to crime. Abandoned buildings collapse. Infrastructure decays.
You are looking at a very slippery downward slope. It's going to be very difficult to turn those situations around. So a fundamental question we have to ask is, how can we rebuild these economies?
"20 years ago, Portland, Oregon saw problems looming in its future. Unlike many cities, Portland didn't look the other way.
Portland was no different than many other urban cities. We could see that we were definitely on a negative trend, and if we did not begin to invest in our downtown and take some pretty drastic steps, that our downtown would deteriorate.
Portland's plan was a radical departure from urban trends of the time. The reformers began by tearing up a freeway that cut through the city center. One of the plan's leaders was former Mayor Buddy Clark.
Freeways cut up a community, they destroy neighborhoods, and they make it just so you drive through the city to get to the suburbs, and we've seen the damage that's done.
Highway funds were redirected to build a brand new light rail system. Public transportation with a revolutionary twist. It was free in the downtown district.
It wasn't easy. I was in the legislature at that time, and there was a lot of controversy in the legislature. There was a lot of controversy here at home because it was going to run through neighborhoods. It was expensive. There was a lot of disruption. But when it was all finished, people said, "It's wonderful."
Another step in the plan was the creation of the Portland Development Commission. It acts as a civic-minded land developer, buying up property and making improvements, creating public parks out of parking garages, building affordable housing along the riverfront. The most controversial aspect of the original plan was the urban growth boundary, because it set a legal limit on how far the city could expand and actually prohibited development beyond that boundary. Portland was, and still is, forced to reinvest in itself. Wealth stays inside the city. Portland has stuck to its urban reform plan for over 2 decades. And it's paid off. Its success makes it a model used by cities all over the world, and it regularly appears high on a list of most livable U.S. cities. The vision of an urban utopia has floated just out of mankind's reach for centuries. movie version of H.G. Wells' story, Of Things to Come, depicts a gleaming new metropolis. It has risen out of the ashes of a destroyed city, a harmonious union of architecture and technology which banishes shoddy housing and congested streets. A progressive elite solves the problem of a mass society, and everybody lives happily ever after. Utopian thinking is nothing new. St. Augustine imagined a city of God in the 5th century. Plato and Thomas More both had utopian schemes for cities. But not too many attempts have been made to create the real thing. One ambitious effort got underway in Brazil in 1960, when President Kubitschek began to build a new capital for the country in the vast uninhabited interior. Brazil would find its manifest destiny as a great power. The new capital, Brasilia, would lead the country out of the past into a glorious techno-future.
Brasilia, in a way, had to symbolize this new way of being, this new way of doing things. And it had to be modern, because it had to be the symbol of this new modern era in Brazil.
50 years in 5, said Kubitschek, and in fact the city was built in just 5 years. Hundreds of roads were built and some 40,000 people shipped in for labor. The city, designed in the shape of a jet plane, was revolutionary. Its designers, urban planner Lucio Costa and architect Oscar Niemeyer, were modernist, minimalist, and purist. In Brasilia, there are no neighborhoods or street names. Instead, there are sectors. You travel from 101S to WS2, not from Main Street to Oak Street, and you travel by car.
The idea is that this should be a city for the machine age, and that meant a city adapted to the private car. The other thing is that it was once believed by urban designers that the cities should be organized according to sectors specifically aiming at certain sorts of practices. The governmental sector, the bank sector, the amusement sector, the housing sector, and so on and so on.
What has emerged is an amalgam of utopianism and science fiction. The city is a testament to the idea of form over function. Buildings shoot up from the starkness of the Brazilian plain, separated by vast, shadeless, open spaces.
Now you don't have a city of places. You have a city of objects in the landscape. So, in a way, we could say that this is not a modern city. I mean, this is as ancient as Tikal or Teotihuacan or a feudal castle in France, because all those places were specialized places for either ceremony or politics. And always these places have the characteristics of discontinuity, specialization of sectors, and specialization of practices. They were not places for daily life of the inhabitants.
Daily life is inconvenient, if not downright dangerous. The city was designed so that the automobile could move about freely, but not the pedestrian. There are hardly any traffic lights and virtually no sidewalks. The city has few traffic jams, but crossing a street is like playing Russian roulette. Brasilia has one of the highest pedestrian death rates in the world. The plan for paradise backfired.
Sometimes these geometric spatial systems, these logical systems by planners ignore the reality of commerce in people's lives and human scales, and they end up deadening what would be the normal vitality of cities.
Brasilia was built with plenty of housing for the capital's well-paid government bureaucrats, but little room for anyone else.
Physical segregation in the city primarily, I think, has to do with social segregation. When we have big distances among the buildings themselves, among the places for living and places for working, then the problems of segregation are maximized.
The majority of the nearly 2 million people who work in Brasilia must live in satellite communities which have sprung up in a ring 15 miles away from the modern capital.
And the idea was that the future metropolis should not be jeopardized, should not be stained. And from the very beginning, these people who built the city were housed in places far away from the pilot plant itself.
Despite the disadvantages, some of the outlying towns have grown into lively, bustling little cities with plenty of street life. Others, though, are shanty towns plagued by poverty and disease. One of the satellite communities is Sunrise Valley, which is home to a millennial sect that believes Brasilia is the chosen city, and that they will come to claim it in the 21st century. In some ways, it is a mirror image of bureaucratic, hierarchical Brasilia. Everyone gets a role, a rank, and a flamboyant uniform. Sect members also believe that when they die, they will go to the universal bus station, an idea aimed directly at the poor who must spend half their lives on buses traveling to and from their menial jobs in the capital. In a sense, the people of Sunrise Valley refuse to lose hope for Brasilia. And maybe they're right. Given enough time, even this rigid city could bend to the needs of all of its inhabitants.
Life always has the last word. And when you look at city planning, you realize that ultimately it's not planners that direct cities, that cities will always overcome planners if that's what forces are pushing them to do. And people will always overcome planners. People are very ingenious.
It always comes back to the people. People make the city what it becomes.
When I think of a city, I think of the evolution of a settlement over time, the vitality of the people who are there. I think of how they celebrate life and the human condition and experience in the great enterprise, in the great exchange of ideas and values that happen in this grand marketplace, the city.
In the next quarter century, as cities expand to contain most of the world's population, their fate will determine humanity's fate as never before.